Hello and welcome to the Airlock IAM 8.2 release video. I am Mark, and together with Mike I'm going to talk about new features in the IAM 8.2 release. In this video we'll discuss the shown features. The video has chapter markers so you can easily jump to the desired topics of interest. We'll start with State Externalization Part 2. It's about how to run IAM in cloud-native setups or in active-active setups. In Chapter 2, we show a few new Airlock 2FA features. It's basically about two new login experiences and some other improvements. Chapter 3 is about new OpenID Connect features. Mainly it's about hybrid flow, persistent user consents, some UX improvements, and some new OpenID Connect client features. The UI resource set feature in Chapter 3 is a new way to handle multiple login app designs in one login app instance. Finally, in the Scriptable flow step chapter, we show a new way to configure IAM. It's the first time IAM allows to include scripts in the configuration. Chapter 6 is about metrics. It's a new endpoint providing metrics in a standard format. Last but not least, we show some various other features and general release information. IAM state externalization is about how to operate IAM in a cloud-native environment or how to support active-active setups. It's called Part 2 because we have already shown in the release webinar of IAM 8.1 how state externalization works. So this part of the video is first a repetition of how it works in general. So for those who have watched Airlock IAM 8.1 release video, they probably might skip the first part. Then we'll show what is really new in Airlock 8.2. So let's start with how Airlock, the traditional setup of Airlock works, so you can understand what has been added in 8.1 and 8.2. So in a traditional setup, you have an Airlock gateway usually in front of Airlock IAM instances, and IAM instances, they store all the session information locally in the memory. This requires session sticky load balancing, because on the left side, in instance A, we have all the session data from sessions that started on this instance, the red ones, and on the right side, we have the green ones. We have all the session information that of sessions that started on the right side. But these informations about sessions, they are not exchanged between the IAM instances. So it's necessary for Airlock Gateway to send all requests of session A to the left side and all requests of session B to the right side. So basically there is no intra-session high availability. If the left IAM goes down, session information is lost and only sessions of the right side will survive and be still available to the user. This may thus lead to session loss in case of an IAM failure, and it also requires, as said, session sticky load balancing. Session sticky load balancing is not a friend of dynamic horizontal scaling, so it's not possible just to add or remove IAM instances with running sessions. This is not really cloud environment friendly. That's the reason why we came up with the state externalization feature in 8.1 and improved it in 8.2. If you don't want to use this feature, you don't have to do anything. The traditional setup still works with 8.2 and also with future releases. So just ignore it if you're not interested in that. You don't have to migrate any configuration. You don't have to set up a Redis cluster or whatever. So what is new in 8.1 and 8.2? Now we allow to store session data in an external session store. It's a Redis cluster. So each Airlock IAM instance is connected to a Redis cluster, and all the session data will be written to the Redis cluster and can be shared among the various IAM instances. So as a consequence, requests to IAM can be sent to any IAM instance. There is no more need for session sticky load balancing. This allows for active-active setups, so you can theoretically use any number of IAM instances. You can scale horizontally. It also works with an ingress or some other load balancer that does not allow session sticky load balancing. So what features do we support with this state externalization? So it's really about the login app, it's about the admin app, and it's about the transaction approval modules. These are the three modules where we think horizontal scaling and always up is very important. So we implemented the feature for these three IAM modules, but not for the other ones. I will come to that later. What is really new in 8.2, because probably you saw this already in the 8.1 video. So we added support for SAML. We also added support for radius OTP, which was excluded in 8.1. And we do also allow state encryption. We'll come to that a bit later on the next slide. And transaction approval is actually also new. It didn't work with 8.1. Then there has been a lot of tuning and improvements with learnings from the first release 8.1 with their feature. So what is not supported by the feature? So there's one single admin app feature which is not supported. It's called bulk changes. It's very rarely used and it cannot be used in conjunction with state externalization. The config editor is not supported, so we don't think that you're going to edit a running configuration in a clustered IAM instance. The idea is that you edit and develop the configuration elsewhere using another EIM instance, for example, an EIM installation, and then you transfer the final configuration to the cluster of active IAM instances. Also not supported is the API policy service and the service container. So what else did we improve in 8.2? So 8.2 is the first release where you probably want to upgrade from a setup with a Redis cluster, 8.1 to 8.2, again with a setup with a Redis cluster. So probably you want to do this at runtime without losing session. So how could this look like? So assume we have the state before the migration on the left. It's all 8.1 instances using a Redis cluster and state externalization. So for simplicity, I just put in 2 IAM instances and not many of them. So as you see, all the state in the Redis cluster on the bottom, the red boxes, it's all 8.1 compatible state information. And after the migration, it should look like this. All the instances have been updated to 8.2 and all the state is 8.2 state. So how can we do, or what can we do with Airlock IAM 8.2 to allow to do this at runtime? So what we can support is we can have a mixed state with the left IAM is still 8.1 and the right IAM is still 8.2, so you can migrate them step by step. And the Redis cluster now contains both state from 8.1 IAMs and state from 8.2 IAMs. So what is really important is on the top left where it says only 8.1 sessions. So what we require that this works is a so-called blue-green deployment. So the ingress, for example, in this image, or the load balancer or reverse proxy, it has to guarantee that once a session is migrated to 8.2, it always has to stay on the right side. So we have to make sure that the left side only receives requests that are on 8.1 sessions, and the right side, it can receive requests from both 8.1 or 8.2 sessions. It's called blue-green deployment, and it's a pretty common setup to update software. There's another limitation. So The whole sessions, they persist when they're being migrated, but ongoing IAM flows, they are aborted for security reasons. So if a user is in the midst of an IAM flow, the user may have to start the flow again, but the whole session, including all the session information like acquired tags and roles and stuff like that, it's not affected by the upgrade, so most of the users are not going to see anything of the upgrade during the upgrade phase. So how to configure external state repositories? So just go to the main settings, and there you find it was introduced with 8.1, a new property called state repository. By default, it's the in-memory state repository. So just as it was before this new feature, here you can select a Redis state repository and then configure that. Here the configuration is all about the connection to the Redis cluster, and also, this is also new for 8.2, whether you want to encrypt the state that is stored in the Redis cluster. So be aware that this state information can contain very sensitive information, so you might want to encrypt it in IAM and decrypt it again in IAM, so nobody else that has access to the Redis cluster can see or change anything. It's also possible to migrate from non-encrypted to encrypted state information without losing any session information. You can find information about that in the manual. Airlock IAM 8.2 contains new Airlock 2FA features and some improvements. I'm going to start with showing two new ways of how users can be authenticated using Airlock 2FA. First, the online QR code login. So maybe this sounds familiar with you, but so far Airlock IAM only supported the offline QR code login. So this is about the online QR code login. Let me show you how it could look like for an end user. So on a login page, we assume that the user enters a username or otherwise identifies the user. It could be username and password. Here it's shown with a passwordless example, just providing the username. Then on the next screen on the browser, the QR code is shown, and the user uses the smartphone to scan that QR code, approves the login on the phone, and the user is then logged in. So maybe you note that there was no need to enter OTP code, as it is the case for offline QR code variant. And it can be used for authentication for all kinds of self-services and for transaction approval. It works really well with passwordless setups, but not only, you can also use it as a second factor after a password. The feature works with the current versions of the Airlock 2FA app and all the custom apps. With usernameless, another way to authenticate users, we go a step further. So this looks like the following. On the login page, we directly show a QR code. The QR code changes from time to time to reduce the window of attack possibilities. So note here that there is no input field to enter username or whatsoever. The user just takes the phone, scans the QR code with the app, confirms it, and the user is logged in. So again, there's no need to enter anything for the user. It's really very easy and good user experience. It can be used for authentication flows only. If you like to use QR codes for transaction approval or approving other stuff, then you can combine it with the online QR code feature. It enforces two devices. So what you cannot do, you cannot be on the web browser on your phone and then use the usernameless QR code login on the same phone with the app. So it always has to be two devices, like a web browser on a laptop and a phone, or a web browser on your tablet and a phone, and so on. It doesn't work with the current version of the Airlock 2FA app. So it will work with the next version, which is about to be released in around end of April or beginning of May 2024. So if you are trying to use the feature, check out if the new app has already been released. It works with all custom apps that use an up-to-date FutureA SDK. So what else is in Airlock 8.2 regarding Airlock 2FA? So now we have in all the steps, not only in authentication, we have full control about how priorities of the different authentication factors are handled. So in all the steps around Airlock 2FA, it's about authentication, self-services, transaction approval, and so on. You now have the config property that you see in the screenshot, where you can just drag and the factors and put them in the desired order. So in this example, for example, we would prefer one touch over one online QR code, and that comes before offline QR code, and so on. Another new feature is Airlock 2FA payload encryption. What is it about? It's about end-to-end encryption of extra infos between IAM and the FutureA, and between FutureA and the app. So what are extra infos? So extra infos, as shown in this example, it's typically personal or potentially personal information that is shown in the Airlock 2FA app during transaction approval, or it could also be during logging or any other approval type. This is called extra info. With the new feature, this information is encrypted in the IAM application and decrypted by FutureA, and then encrypted again by FutureA and decrypted on the mobile phone app. So it adds another layer of security and secures this personal or potentially personal information more than it did before. Yeah. It works for all flow types. It works with newer apps, so with the upcoming Airlock 2FA app, which we expect in April or May 2024. And it works with all custom apps with the up-to-date FutureA SDK. So check out your SDK that you're using, or what Airlock 2FA app you're using before planning to use the feature. It may require an Airlock 2FA service subscription upgrade. How to configure it? Just go to the Airlock 2FA settings, and there you will find a new property called Payload Encryption Key. And you can copy the payload encryption key from the FutureA admin console as shown here. There it's called extra info key. You just copy that key here and you activate the feature and you're done. Various new other features regarding Airlock 2FA are: we improved log correlation. So we log the FutureA session ID, for example, in IAM logs. So it's easier to correlate IAM logs with FutureA logs. We now support the bypass feature. The bypass feature is a feature that you can use to bypass all Airlock 2FA authentication for users that are marked for bypass. So it's used primarily for automated testing, and really use it with care, because it's an inherent security risk. So only use it in non-productive environments and only when you really understand what you're doing. Please read also the warnings in our documentation about that.
Using Airlock IAM as an OpenID provider or an authorization server in the OAuth environment, or as a client to connect to external authorization servers is an important feature. So in 8.2, we've added quite a few bits of functionality to our authorization server and also to the OIDC client. And I'm going to walk you through those. Let's get started with the hybrid flow. The hybrid flow is a specification compliant implementation, and the link on this page here leads you directly to the OpenID Connect specification if you're interested. If you're looking at the hybrid flow and particularly what use cases it supports, then it's mostly about public clients running on the same device. Public clients are those in the OAuth specification that are not very good at keeping client ID and client secret really secret. And running on the same device implies that it's either a mobile app that is running on a mobile phone or a tablet computer, and it's using the embedded system browser for authentication. The other use case would be a single-page application running in a browser that is both the user interface to the authentication flow, as well as the client that actually then interacts using tokens with some REST APIs. Well, the hybrid flow in these use cases has the advantage of a simplified flow. It uses less REST calls to actually do the interactions, so this is convenient, especially for mobile app developers. But there's also some caveats. One is security. If you're using the hybrid flow, then tokens are directly delivered to the browser and they're not protected by client authentication requirement, which, for example, the authorization code flow would do for you. That's one caveat. The other caveat is refresh tokens are not delivered in the hybrid flow the way it is specified. And we are specification compliant. You're only going to get a refresh token if you exchange the authorization code on the token endpoint. And then there's basically very little difference with the authorization code flow. And you could also use the authorization code flow and gain the additional security because tokens are only delivered after authentication. So that's the hybrid flow in a nutshell. Let's go into a little bit more detail. This is a drawing, a sequence diagram of the hybrid flow. You see the client that is actually the client that needs to receive the tokens. We have here, the browser. The browser is interacting with the user and doing the authentication. And you have the two endpoints, the authorization endpoint for browser interaction and the token endpoint for the client interactions. When you start the flow, there is a parameter response type. We've already had that in past, but it has new attributes that you can use here. You can either provide an ID token and or a token, which will basically force the authorization endpoint to return you an ID token or an access token or both, depending on what the client requests that he will get. The lower part of the flow down here, basically, if it's missing, then you're only using the hybrid part of the hybrid flow. If it's present, then it's almost an authorization code flow. Of course, there's the difference that at the authorization endpoint will return tokens, with the authorization code flow would never do. One particular thing that you have to note, and that's specification compliant. When you return tokens from the authorization endpoint, the ID and access token, and when you return tokens from the token endpoint, they can be different. You can specify them differently. And as we're going to see, our implementation supports this behavior as it is declared in the specification. Which brings me to configuration. If you're looking at the hybrid flow, how do you configure it? Well, it's very easy to enable. There's only one checkbox here, and an authorization code flow will then also support the hybrid flow. And you can configure hybrid flow access token format here and ID token format. We can reuse the specification or the configuration that you've already done for the authorization code flow, or you can have different plugins configured here with different content for those tokens as your requirements are. A second topic that I would like to cover is persisting consents. Before in IAM 8.2, consents had to be granted by the end user for every single authentication. The only way you could get away from that is by basically configuring that no consents were required. Now with 8.2, we're storing consents in the database, and once they are granted, they remain granted until they are withdrawn. What does this mean for you? Well, to use this feature, you have to do a DB schema upgrade. Otherwise, you can't save those consents into the database. And what you get is you can also get a consent view and delete feature in the admin app. And I'm going to show you that very quickly. This is a screenshot of the admin app. The OAuth2 token tab shown here has been extended because it now also shows the consents, and the consents you find in the lower half of the display. Consent management segregates consents by authorization server. So if you have multiple, the administrator or the help desk employee can select which authorization server is what we need to talk about. And then it's split by client. If the user is using multiple clients, then you can see all these clients in the listing. And you can start now deleting consents. You can delete a simple scope. You can delete all scopes that are granted to a particular client, or you can delete all the clients and scopes for a particular authorization server. There's only the delete option. An administrator will never be able to add a consent to a particular user. That's always something that the user has to do themselves. So that's consent management in the admin app and consent persistence for authorization servers. We've improved the user experience for OpenID Connect users, and the way we do that, or what we did here, is that we're trying to reduce interactions as much as possible. An authentication that does not interact with the end user but is still secure, it's actually ideal. And that's exactly what we want to achieve when we're starting an authorization call with the option prompt equals none. Prompt equals none is directly from the standard, and it basically forces the authorization server to authenticate the user and to fail should user interaction become necessary. So in other words, as soon as the login up UI needs to be started, this authorization flow or authentication flow should fail. Now, we need, or what we've added with 8.2 is the ability to combine this with Remember Me tokens. So if you have an authentication flow and a Remember Me token would actually lead to a situation where that authentication flow runs through non-interactive from start to end, then you can now combine that with the authorization code flow. The authorization code flow will, with prompt equals none, start the authentication flow. If the Remember Me token is there, it will authenticate. If it's not there, then instead of going interactive and showing username, password screens and other things, it will just return a failure, and the client will receive that fail and will be able to deal with it. So with this, you can fine-tune your user experience as you see fit for your application. We've also added improvements when you're using our IAM as a OpenID Connect client or as an OAuth client. The first is you can add now custom request parameters when you talk to the external authorization server. Typical use cases for this would be that you want to supply the username for a login hint parameter, or you want to add display equals pop-up or prompt equals none, as we've seen before, and have the external or the third-party authorization server deal with that. The other thing we've added is pushed authorization requests, or PAR for short. PAR is a financial grade API or FAPI specification compliant method of initiating an authorization code flow. What we do here is instead of the client formulating a URL, handing that URL over to the browser and the browser then starting the flow, where the URL contains all the parameters of the request. We don't do that anymore. Why? Well, if you have all these parameters on the URL that the browser receives, then they could be manipulated by that browser. So if a man-in-browser attack was successful for a particular user, then you could actually fudge those parameters and do things that you shouldn't be able to do. And we want to prevent this type of manipulation. How does the standard do that? Well, instead of sending the entire request to the browser, the request data is sent to the authorization server, and the authorization server returns an identifier to the client. And now the client instructs the browser with just the identifier to connect to the authorization server, and the authorization server will retrieve the request details from its own database. So there's no manipulation in the URL possible, and this is much more secure, and that's also why it's part of the financial grade API specification. With this implementation, we only support the client part. The server part will be coming in the fall 2024 release. So this is later this year and not right now. Managing customizations for multiple customers on the same IAM instance is a use case that we've seen demand for from different sources. And that's why we introduced a new concept called the UI resource set. Now, what's a UIE resource set? It's nothing but a fancy name for basically the zip archive that you're creating when you're using the software design kit to create a customization for the login app UI. So this zip archive contains GIFs, images, JavaScript, stylings, translations, links, and things like that. The feedback we received is that customers were telling us that, hey, there is a problem because we have product names in translations, we have domain names in links, we have corporate colors, company logos, variable names in JavaScript, and we want not that this is mixed from different customers or partners into the same customization, because then in the browser, if you look at the resources that you retrieve there, you can see that we have these partners or customers on our IAM. And that's from a privacy perspective not acceptable to us. So find a solution. And that's actually what we did. We found a solution. What we do is we're still using the software design kit. We're creating the zip archive, but we're creating individual zip archives for the different customers. So you can have 10, 100, 1000 zip archives, and you just have to manage them. How do you do that? Well, you configure a filter rule in the UI settings of the login app to select the correct resource set with a URL pattern. So if it's URL pattern 1, then it's resource set 1. If it's URL pattern 2, then it's resource set 2, and so forth. And you can add as many of those as you want. The second thing you need to do is you have to configure in instance properties where the directory is where you're going to deploy those resource set archives. And you can actually deploy them into a directory structure. Doesn't matter. IAM will search the entire tree, starting with the directory you indicated in instance properties, and find all the resource set. The third thing you need to do is, you actually need to restore the resource sets in the directory so that they can be found by IAM. And with that in place, we can now decide which resource set to deliver for which URL pattern. Now, to complete the feature, I should explain the terms default resource set, and UI tenant ID, because UI tenant ID is something that we introduced a few releases ago, and it was also geared towards separating customizations based on rules that you can configure. So let me give you an example on how this works and what the different terms mean. I'm starting with a URL like mycustomer.com/application. And I have one IAM that has a pattern matcher that checks for those URLs and decides on whether this is for customer A, or it could be for customer B, or the URL could be for customer C. If none of those match, then we have a fallback, and that's what the default resource set does. It's the fallback, and it's the default customization. If you're a customer that doesn't need all this fancy matching thing because you only have one customization, then that's what you're going to use. You're going to use the default resource set, which we already introduced in 7.5, and that's where you define the location of your resource set file, and you're done. You don't have to use the other things. UI tenant ID now applies within a resource set. So for example, here we're looking at customer A, and we have a URL matcher that decides which tenant it is. It might be something in the past that indicates that. Or for customer B, I have a different use case. I'm using different tenant customizations based on which OAuth client is actually accessing this authorization server. For customer C, I don't use UI tenant ID at all, so it remains empty and there is no matching necessary. And in the default customization, I'm basically deciding which UI tenant it is based on the SAML client. If it matches a certain pattern, then it will be those UI tenant ID customizations. If it's another pattern, then it's another UI tenant ID. So you see, you can combine the default resource set, which is the absolute minimum, and no UI tenant ID, whatever. Customer C would be that use case. You can combine it with resource sets and really decide in separate files what the resources should be that should be used to authenticate that user. And you can use UI tenant ID to actually have more fine granular control, but there the customizations are all within the same file. And that's the resource set feature that we are introducing with IAM 8.2. Aside from customization, we have added another capability with IAM 8.2 that will be very useful, and that's the scriptable flow step. It does exactly what the name says. It allows you to run scripts during a flow. So here is an example of a flow, and in the dark color you see the scriptable flow step, and what it can do is the following. You can define a list of value map providers that will inject the values into the script. You can define the script source, and then a script engine will take over. It will run the script, it will use the input values to calculate some output, and you can hand back output values, a list of key value pairs, back to Airlock IAM for further processing in other steps. To enhance the capabilities of the script engine, you can add libraries in a particular directory. If those libraries are there, then they will be used, and you can just take advantage of both scripts as libraries, but also shared object files. So for example, we're using curl library in our example script, and the curl library is a shared object file. It's been written in either C or C++, and it will extend the capabilities. Everything is done with Lua as the scripting language. Lua is very lightweight. It only adds a few megabytes to the executables, the Airlock IAM executable, and that's also a nice side effect, so that you can use scripts without paying too much for that. Currently, as I said, scripts are available as stepped, and the step has to be non-interactive. There's no way how you're going to get a user interface or an interaction with the user from a scripting step. In the documentation, and you see here the link, Airlock IAM docs, you will find an example that tells you or shows you on how to use the scripting step. It will have 3 scriptable steps in there. It will have additional steps that will use the output from the script. Very large, extensive use case example, but it should help you get started writing your own scripts. Looking at the configuration of the scriptable step, again, I already told you, you have input values that you can add, you have the script itself, you have the output map with the key that you define that you want to return to Airlock IAM. You can also add secrets. For example, in our example, we do basic auth, and the secret of the basic auth we inject like this, and you can define namespaces. So if you have several scripts that have the same output keys defined, that you can differentiate between those. To summarize, the scriptable step will include a CJSON library to convert input and output value maps into things that Airlock IAM can deal with. There is an integrated logging mechanism which you can use to, number one, keep track of what the scripts are doing, and number two, to debug the scripts. You have tested libraries, curl, base64, that you can easily add to the scripting engine. It's been tested with step conditions. We can use the output values in regular IAM steps. It's very lightweight, works off the box on all Linux platforms. So you Mac users out there have to be strong, because it doesn't work out of the box on Mac, but there's only 2 command lines that you have to enter, and it will work on the Mac. There's some caveats. It runs in the same context as Airlock IAM. So the script, if it's successfully attacked, can be exploited to attack Airlock IAM. So I recommend that you be careful with that. There's also limited performance management. We will allow a script to run for 30 seconds and then kill it. If it runs longer than 30 seconds, during that time, it can, of course, use maximal resources. If you have several flows running in parallel, that could have an impact on the behavior of your IAM. So be careful when you test scripts that you don't have any runaway processes. And last but not least, it's an incubating feature. Future versions may be breaking, so take this into consideration. Now, why do we release an incubating feature? Well, we want to know what you think of it. Let us know what works, what needs improvement with the scriptable step. Just open up a case and tell us what you think, especially if there is something that you want changed or improved. Because we intend to develop further improvements in future releases of IAM, but we really want your feedback on this. Thanks for that in advance.
Metrics in Airlock IAM. Airlock IAM 8.2 introduces a new metrics endpoint. It provides metrics that can be used for monitoring and other operational tasks. Let me give you an example. For example, metrics could be about container memory, JVM memory. It could be about heap and non-heap memory. It could be about open file descriptors of the JVM process. And usually such metrics are used for an operation environment like Kubernetes or something else to constantly check whether IAM instances are still healthy, how they develop, and whether they need to be restarted or not. But it can also be used to look at business relevant information like the amount of logins per second and so on. So Airlock IAM provides a new metrics endpoint, and it provides metrics in the Prometheus and Open Metrics compliant formats. So it can be used with any other tool, like the images shown on the right. They are not produced by IAM, but they are produced by a standard metrics visualization tool that has nothing to do with IAM, but it can read and process the information because it's compliant to these standards. So in 8.2, what IAM provides are really JVM, so Java VM metrics, and some system metrics. We have planned to add more metrics, especially business metrics, so like number of logins and stuff like that, but it's not yet included in 8.2. It's very easy to enable the new metrics endpoint. Just go to the instant property file and enable it by specifying a metrics port.
As always with the new release, there is a list of smaller features that we have added, and of course this is also the case for IAM 8.2. I'm going to start off with a feature that is about password end-to-end encryption using AWS KMS. The goal is that when a browser wants to send a password that the user just entered to IAM, this password should be protected with a key. And the key material required to actually unencrypt this password should be stored in the KMS on Amazon Web Services. So the browser basically generates a random key and encrypts the password. It then sends the package to IAM, and IAM immediately sends the random key that was used to encrypt the password forward to Amazon Web Services, who decrypt that. Now, IAM is able to decrypt the password. It has it in plain text and it hashes it. To store the hash in encrypted format, again, key material on AWS is used. We encrypt the password hash, and now we can compare the encrypted hash that we've received from the browser and the encrypted hash that is stored in the database. If they're the same, then it must be the same password, and you'll find the authentication was successful. How you can use that in the product? Well, in the login app, you can use end-to-end encryption during authentication. You can also use it during password change self-service or password reset self-service. In the admin app, when you set a password, you generate one or you generate a password letter, end-to-end encryption will work as well. And in the service container, when you do password letter generation in bulk, you also can use this feature. I think it's a very sensible thing to have, and with AWS KMS, it's also very easy to use in your deployment if you're on the Amazon Web Services cloud platform.
Airlock IAM 8.2 comes with some admin app improvements. First, the admin app can be called with a few new URL parameters. These features are thought for applications that directly access the admin app and want to influence some of the behavior of the admin app. Note that most of the features need to be enabled or configured in the configuration. So if you don't do anything in the configuration, most of these features will not work out of the box. First, there's a new parameter called login URL. So you can pass it when accessing the admin app. And when the admin app would show its own login page, it redirects to the login URL you provided here. This makes it possible to use an external login application, for example, an IAM login app, to access and log in into the admin app. Similarly, there's also an after logout URL parameter. If you pass this to the admin app will not show the admin app login screen after logout, but it will redirect to this page after logout. Then you can pass a skin parameter. By this, you can influence the skin of the admin app, which is basically the basic color that the admin app is shown in. This can be useful if you want to dynamically show it in green or orange and blue to distinguish different instances or different stages and so on. Then you can access directly a tab in a user. In this example, you would open the user John Doe and directly show the password or open the password tab. There's a whole list of tabs with identifiers. Here it's password, which can be found in the documentation of the admin app. And another feature, so moving away from the URLs and the URL parameters, is translations for admin and user roles. So far in Airlock IAM, when it was about to assign or unassign roles to or from users, you could only see the technical names of the roles, like in this example, which is from the demo configuration where it's customer, employee, and admin. It's just the way they are stored in the database or in a directory. Now it is possible to provide translations, so it can be a label that is more human readable, and it can be different for different languages, like in the example shown here, in English and in German. Then there have been some bug fixes regarding timeout handling, regarding screen overflows on smaller screen, and regarding paging when it comes to page through a lot of users in the admin app. Please go to the changelog of the release to get all the details about that. So what else is in 8.2? Now it is possible to provide custom captcha providers. So if you're not happy with the captcha providers we provide in the product, it's possible to add new ones as long as they follow certain API restrictions. And it's now also possible to place a captcha on the default product username and password page. Then note that we do no longer support old SSL and TLS protocols, which are insecure, for LDAP connections. So this is used to connect to an LDAP or an Active Directory. And if your Active Directory LDAP still uses one of the really old SSL or TLS protocols, they have to be upgraded to use a new one. Without that, it won't work anymore. IAM will no longer be able to connect to them. Then last but not least, we added some more steps around FIDO and passkey. It's now also possible to use FIDO or passkey steps in self-services, which is public and protected self-services to approve some user action.
We're moving. Well, that's not entirely true. Aragon's not moving. We're staying at where we are right now, but our container registry is moving, and I would like to inform you about that. So far, we provide our containers from Docker Hub. If you have an account there, you can download them and directly throw them into your DevOps pipelines, and all of that is going to change because we're moving to Quay. Who's affected? Well, only customers that that have access to Docker Hub and use it in their pipelines. Those that use TechZone still, that will remain unchanged. You can download the software from there, container image or not. That really is up to you. And when will it happen? We'll start in April. So the 8.2 release should at some time in April be available on Quay. And Docker Hub will be gone with the release in fall 2024. So that's September or October this year. What do you need to do to get access to Quay and get access to those IAM images? Well, it's 4 easy steps. You register an account on Quay.io, which really is a Red Hat account because Red Hat has taken over Quay.io. If you already have a Red Hat account, of course, you don't need to register a new one. Then you create a case to communicate this account to Ergon. We'll add you to the group that has access to those images, and you will receive an invitation email from Quay.io. Accept the invitation, and you'll have access to the registry. So it's really not a major change for you. It should be fairly easy to achieve. And I hope that within the next 6 months, you will find the time to do it because, as I said, Docker Hub will begin in fall of 2024.
Last but not least, some general information about the Airlock IAM 8.2 release. How to upgrade. The release is non-breaking. This means that if you're using just existing features, no new features, then no manual steps are required to do the upgrade. However, if using the OpenID Connect consent persister feature, a database schema upgrade is mandatory. But we recommend to update the database schema anyway with every release. It makes future updates easier and it's easier to try out new features. How to upgrade is documented in the manual in chapter 6.5. The release is released in the beginning of April 2024 and it will be supported until end of January 2026. The release has priority low. This means that there are no critical security bug fixes in the release, so there's no need to urgently install the release. However, when looking at the end of support dates of the previous releases, we suggest for customers that are still on 7.7 or 8.0 to upgrade soon to 8.2. For customers that are on 8.1, we suggest to use 8.2 if you are using, if you're trying to use new features that are only available in the new release. The next release, we'll call it 2024 Fall, will be available at the end of September or at the beginning of October 2024. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it and you got some information about 8.2. Don't hesitate to contact us.